This is how you cross over from Israel to Gaza, and right now we're in no man's land. Prime Minister, do you now regret when once asked what your favourite joke was, you replied, Nick Clegg? And Deputy Prime Minister, what do you think of that?
Mr. Trump, why should you be president? What makes you fit for the role? Is it just one big ego trip?
Thank you very much.
People aren't sure they can trust what you say. You say things and then it turns out that they're not quite what you said.
And if we deliver what we say we're going to deliver.
My name's Andy Bell and I've been a journalist for over 30 years. After a quick summer break, welcome back for this, the second series of the podcast How Did We Get Here?, where I and a guest provide background and context to a big story in the news. This week, Brexit is back, and how. Not only has Boris Johnson set mid-October for a deadline for any deal, he wants to unpick the withdrawal agreement he's already signed. The EU have said he must drop that plan by the end of the month. So as things get Brexit frantic again, who better to talk to than Anand Menon from the UK in a changing Europe, one of the foremost authorities on all things Brexit. So does Anand Menon think this week's row has scuppered any chance of a deal?
Not necessarily, no. I think the one thing that has changed this week is that the government has obviously picked two big fights. There's going to be a fight with the courts over the internal market bill because there is a clause in it, clause 45, that kind of implies that whatever ministers do under this bill and whatever the courts have said, even if it's contradictory, what happens now overrides it, and the courts will want to say over that. And of course, the government's picked a massive fight with the devolved governments who hate this bill for a variety of reasons. What is not clear is whether the European Union is going to want to go to war over this bill. And I say that because the EU is nothing if not pragmatic. They get the fact that the withdrawal agreement measures in the internal market bill are there in the event that the so-called joint committee that is negotiating how the Northern Ireland Protocol works doesn't come to an agreement. If it does come to an agreement, then that's fine. And I suspect that the EU will keep a weather eye on this. They're not happy. They feel that we've broken international law by passing this bill. But my hunch is they will keep negotiating in the hope that we can get a trade deal and an agreement in the joint committee, which means that all the provisions in this bill that relate to Brexit are null and void effectively.
I mean, you say we don't know if the EU is going to want to pick a fight over this. It looks rather as if the British government has deliberately picked a fight over this. Is that fair?
Well, I think what seems fair is that the modus operandi of this government is to pick fights whenever and with whomever it can. And this bill continues in that tradition, which is, pick a few opponents, have a go at them. And this bill kind of sums it up.
I mean, the government says, look, all this is we have to have a legal safety net in place to avoid unforeseen situations where if we don't have agreement with the other side, we default into terrible circumstances which put barriers in the Irish Sea and, threaten the peace process. Do you buy any of that?
Not particularly, because actually there is a legal safeguard built into the Northern Ireland Protocol anyway, that says in the event of extreme circumstances, you can suspend these provisions. So I think that was there anyway, and that could have been used. So there's certainly an element of posturing to this, I would have thought. And remember, the government is talking to several audiences at once. One of them are Leave voters who want to be reassured that the Prime Minister will do, in that well-worn phrase, whatever it takes. And the other are his own backbenchers, many of whom have been arguing that we should just rip up the withdrawal agreement now that they've read it, even though many of them voted for it at the time.
So you use the word posturing. Do you feel that what we've seen this week has basically been posturing by the UK government?
Call it posturing, call it political theatre, call it showmanship. I think it could be good politics. I think there are lots of negative implications of yesterday's bill. One is for our international reputation. Another is for our ability to talk about others breaching international law. It's going to be a lot harder now for Dominic Raab to stand up and castigate the Chinese for breaching international agreements. That being said, the other defining feature of this government to date has been it's been quite short-termist in how it approaches things. And this is about dealing with the issues on the table now rather than worrying about any medium-term implications for our international standing.
So assuming we get through this crisis that we've seen this week, we're then still in the negotiations, we're coming to the end of the 8th round, presumably heading into a 9th round of talks with the EU about a free trade agreement of some kind. For those of us who maybe have taken our eye off the ball a bit over the last few months, where are we? What are the sticking points with that big overarching agreement?
I can't believe anyone has taken their eye off this ball, to be honest, Andy. But for those who might have done, what I'd say is the sticking points are what they've always been. They are over fish. They are over these so-called level playing field provisions, which are all about making sure Britain guarantees certain standards of workers' rights, environmental protections, and this has sort of taken centre stage recently, about state subsidies, about the European Union being concerned about this government's desire to subsidise private sector companies and to give them an unfair advantage when it comes to them trading in the European market.
Now, can we do a deal on those? Let's start with fish. Can we do a deal on fish?
Yes, I think we can do a deal on fish. It will require, as all these issues will require, I think ultimately the problem at the moment is that political principles, the heads of state, the prime ministers, have not given sufficient attention to Brexit. Why? Because on the EU side, Brexit has fallen off their list of priorities entirely. But I think once they start thinking about it again, there is obviously space for a compromise, and that will involve slightly less access for European boats to our fishing waters, and perhaps an agreement that every few years the British Parliament gets to decide whether or not it wants to continue with whatever arrangements we arrive at. That gives us our control and our sovereignty back. It gives British fishermen more fish, but it will also hopefully guarantee those same fishermen who export to the European market continued access to that market.
But you think that will take, say, the French president, the Spanish prime minister, the Dutch prime minister actively getting involved rather than just leaving it to the Commission?
Absolutely, because I think we forget this too often in this country. They have politics too. And there are political trade-offs to be made. And one of the things front and centre in the Spanish Prime Minister's mind or in President Macron's mind is going to be, do we really want to be irritating the fishing lobby, which again, while in this country is not necessarily a huge part of the economy, but they can be incredibly boisterous when it comes to complaining about the government. And if you want piles of rotting fish on the streets of Paris, then annoy the fishermen. So there are complex political trade-offs to be made in other capitals as well.
What about state aid? What about the sort of level playing field idea? Can we come to an agreement there?
I think the agreement there is in the zone of saying, rather than the European Union saying, which it initially said on state aid, you will sign up to our law and we'll let you know if we think you're in breach, is a system whereby we come to an agreement saying we will only permit a certain amount of A, B or C. In the event that we think you're breaching that understanding, we have the right to impose sanctions on you in the way of tariffs or limiting market access, what they call trade remedies. So that's to say, in the event that we think you are doing too much and it's not fair, we can retaliate. Now, that means the EU has to step back from its insistence on tying us to legal provisions, to European law in the case of state aid, but it means the British government accepting that there are constraints on the amount it can do, otherwise it will face a reaction from the EU in trade terms.
I mean, it's often been said that the EU can't basically allow Britain to leave and have essentially all the benefits of membership without being a member. I mean, is that the part of the fundamental problem as far as finding a deal here that would be acceptable to the UK?
I think the fundamental problem in terms of much of the debate around this is geography. People in government talk a lot about Canada or Australia. And yes, Canada has a trade deal with the European Union. Australia gets on fine without a trade deal, or certainly without a comprehensive free trade agreement with the European Union. Both Canada and Australia are far further away from the European Union than we are. They trade far, far less, both in absolute terms and as a proportion of their overall trade with the European Union. The EU is worried that having a large economy right on its doorstep has implications for competitiveness. So they are desperate to avoid a situation in which we can undercut them, either by slashing our environmental standards so we can be a bit dirtier and therefore a bit cheaper and sell into their market, or by government writing checks for companies that use that advantage to trade at lower prices in the European market than their competitors. And so the EU is saying this is simply about competitiveness. We will not let you, a competitor economy, have access to our market without tariffs, without certain safeguards in place.
But the British say, we've certainly heard David Frost say this, the negotiator, the EU is essentially trying to negotiate on the basis that they won't accept that Britain has left the EU and will be a sovereign country. And they're essentially saying, you may have left, but you've still got to stick to our rules.
Yeah, and there's a degree of truth in that the initial formulations of the EU's demands on state aid sort of implied that we were still a member state, that we would be tied by their rules. Similarly, the initial EU position on fish was we'll have exactly the same number of fish as we had before, thank you very much. So yeah, there's an element of truth to that. That being said, the government here has to accept the fact that we might be free to do what we want on our own terms, but it might have repercussions going forward on our ability to sell into the European market. Now, one of the problems here that isn't talked about very much is you can imagine an even looser sort of free trade agreement where we still have some tariffs. And that might be that the price that the European Union extracts from us for giving us greater regulatory freedom. The problem with that is there simply isn't time to negotiate that sort of deal by the end of the year, because the EU would want to do all sorts of sectoral impact case studies to see what the impact of different sanctions will be on different sectors in different member states. And we haven't got the time to do that by the end of the year.
And what if we can't do a free trade deal? I mean, for a start, a lot of people say that the economic impact of the virus and the pandemic means anything that happens as a result of a no-deal Brexit will be dwarfed. We'll hardly notice it. What do you think of that?
Well, I can't let this go without a quick plug, which is that we are releasing a report on no deal the week after next that goes into the implications in detail. But on this economic argument that COVID will hide the Brexit impact, the answer, I think, is yes and no. Yes, in the sense that for the next 6 to 12 months, the economic impact of COVID will dwarf everything else in aggregate terms. Okay. However, two things I think have to be said against that. Firstly, over the medium term, one of my colleagues at the LSE, Thomas Sampson, has done some modelling on this, and he finds that either with us, the sort of trade deal we're negotiating, or even more so without, the economic impact of Brexit over the next decade will be greater than the economic impact of COVID. It might be less visible, and that has political implications, obviously, but in terms of aggregate impact on the economy, the Brexit impact will be greater. Why? Because we'll get over the pandemic dip. We don't know how quickly, but most economists think pretty quickly, and then growth will resume as normal. Whereas with Brexit, this is a permanent impact on trade with our nearest and biggest trading partner. The second thing is the Brexit impact will be subtly different to the COVID impact in the sense that it hits different parts of the economy. COVID has had a massive impact on retail. Brexit will hit sectors like pharmaceuticals because of new regulations making it harder to trade, and crucially, food. If you think about the pandemic, one of the most amazing things that I don't think we've spent enough time being thankful for is if you go into the supermarket, you can buy exactly the same food at pretty much the same prices as you could beforehand, because that supply chain has kept working. With a no-deal Brexit, not only will trade become more difficult because there will be checks, so it might be harder to get fresh food in at the same volumes unless we have very good warehousing capacities. And I think one of the supermarkets today was warning that actually prices will go up because they don't have the storage facilities. But secondly, prices will also go up because, of course, there will be tariffs involved. And tariffs on some agricultural products are very high indeed. So the Brexit impact will be noticeably different to the COVID impact, which I think makes that argument slightly suspect.
Okay, so let's say we get to January the 1st and there's no deal, no trade agreement. We come to the end of the transition period. Would you expect to see queues of trucks at the channel, for instance, supplies being disrupted, prices in the shops going up for people's basic food shop, that kind of thing?
I would expect food prices to go up. I would expect there to be some disruption at ports. We don't. I mean, obviously, initially not so much because it'll be the 1st of January, and there's far less traffic on that day. We don't know how many firms, particularly on the other side of the channel, are going to say, okay, let's anticipate this by shifting our business elsewhere, which will make the initial disruption look less bad, but will have an impact on our economy. But yes, a no-deal outcome will lead to the need for significant adaptation in the way we trade with the European Union, and that is our biggest trading partner, so that is a lot of adaptation across the board.
And in terms of, you mentioned tariffs, which obviously are basically sort of taxes put on top of products coming in from one country to another. If we have a no deal, anything we're exporting from the UK becomes more expensive going into the EU, whether it's cars or whether it's sheep, meat, lamb, that kind of thing. Is that the case?
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. And it's slightly more complicated than that, remember, because some of the things we export, we import the components for, think of the car industry, and we are going to be charging tariffs on those imports here. So you face, if you like, a double whammy when it comes to tariffs. And remember, in the automobile industry, profit margins aren't that great. And so even a slight incremental increase in costs can have very damaging impacts for car manufacturers.
So when the UK government, Boris Johnson, says we can leave if we have to with an Australia-type deal, which, correct me if I'm wrong, basically translates into no deal at all with the EU, and we'll still profit mightily, what do you make of that?
No, it's absolutely not true. We won't profit from leaving with no deal. We not economically in the short to medium term. There are political gains to be had. If you think actually the most important objective is to regain our ability to regulate our own market, to pass our own laws, to decide on our own immigration levels, this will give us that. We will have unrestrained freedom in that way to legislate as we see fit within the constraints of the fact that other trade agreements might try and impose constraints on us as well. But in economic terms, it is very hard to see how this can be anything other than damaging in the short to medium term.
So Boris Johnson has now said there has to be a deal agreed by the middle of October when there's a European summit. Is he right that that is the deadline by which this has to be done realistically?
Well, there's agreed and agreed, I suppose. I think he's right in the sense that on the 15th of October, all the EU heads of state and government meet, and that is an ideal opportunity for them, and if necessary, Boris Johnson, if they want to invite him along, to sit down and thrash out some of the last thorny issues with their political authority. Okay, so I think he's absolutely right that summit will be crucial. If they haven't dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's by the end of the summit, it's not the end of the world. But unless we have real progress on some of these real matters of principle that divide the two sides, then I think it's time to get a lot more negative about the prospect of a trade agreement.
I mean, do you think the EU is prepared to walk away, if I can put it like that, because they presumably will suffer in a no-deal situation as well?
I think both sides are prepared. I think both sides have a similar position, which is both sides would rather have a deal, but not at any cost. And the question is whether you can fiddle with the relative cost to a point where both sides feel happy signing. Neither side will sign a deal that fundamentally contravenes the core principles that are separating them. But it's a question as to whether you can fudge things or whether you can compromise enough just about to satisfy both sides. But yeah, absolutely, the European Union is thinking through its plans for a no-deal outcome. And remember, because a lower proportion of their trade with us, because the proportion of their trade with us is lower than the proportion of our trade with them, it's going to have a smaller overall impact on them than it will on us.
I mean, some people are saying that Boris Johnson has basically been waiting for a chance to blow this up because in the end, politically, he's happy to walk out. He might even prefer to walk out with no deal. What do you think of that? Do you think that's at all credible?
Well, I mean, this is guesswork. I'm not privy to the innermost workings of the Prime Minister's minds, but my sense is that he would rather have a deal. And he would rather have a deal, one, because it would avoid disruption, not just in terms of the economy, but also in terms of Northern Ireland. Because remember, the harder the Brexit, the harder the border between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And that causes political problems. But also, I think, from a political point of view, just think back to this time last year when Boris Johnson was signing the Withdrawal Agreement. If he manages to pull off a deal in an atmosphere where everyone is shouting about the dangers of no deal, he comes across as a guy who can achieve the impossible. Once again, the Prime Minister has pulled it out of the hat. And I think that politically is probably a more appealing option for the Prime Minister, to be honest.
Now, to get that withdrawal agreement, he did make a big concession about, essentially, he's trying to unpick it now, but about what's going to happen in terms of things going across the Irish Sea between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. But he did make that concession to get that withdrawal agreement. So maybe that's a pointer as to what might happen this time round?
Yeah, I mean, look, both sides are going to have to make concessions for this deal to get over the line. What's going to happen is both sides are going to have to think about where those concessions can be made at least political cost. And I would like to think that's what's going on in both European capitals and here.
Quick technical question. I remember that the Walloon Parliament in Belgium, one half of the country under their federal system, held up a deal with Canada for a while. Would any deal we sign with the EU have to go through all those sorts of hoops, the national parliaments, even some of the federal parliaments?
Here I can give you your favourite answer. Not necessarily. It depends what any eventual deal contains. If the deal is limited to things over which the EU has competence, the EU can sign it off via the heads of state. If it impinges on national competences, i.e. things over which the EU doesn't have control, then all the member states, their national parliaments and their regional parliaments will have to ratify. So it depends on the detail of the treaty. There is some talk at the moment that this might be such a thin agreement that you won't need the national parliaments to ratify it. But we'll have to wait and see what actually comes out at the end of it. Remember, they haven't even started drafting this thing yet because the EU wants agreement on all these matters of principle before the drafting process begins.
And presumably, once if there were to be an agreement signed this year, you could just keep coming back and sign other bits by, as we carry on, or maybe on sectors that have been left out. Is that possible?
Yeah, absolutely it is possible. And I think that's one of the key differences between deal and no deal, is that with no deal, the political atmosphere between us, and not just the EU, but also the 27 individually, will sour considerably, because we'll enter a period where both sides are pointing at the other, saying they are responsible for the economic pain we're feeling because of this. And that's not a great atmosphere in which to go back to the negotiating table. Whereas even if we get the thinnest of thin deals, any kind of agreement at all, it will allow us to keep collaborating, to keep talking, to keep working together far more easily. And I think that will be one of the advantages of getting some sort of agreement.
And the final question, and the unfair one, what do you think are the chances of an agreement this year?
Well, I'm allergic to putting numbers on these things, but I still think there's a pretty good chance there'll be a deal at the end of this.
Despite all what we've seen this week, with government saying we're prepared to break the law and all of that?
I don't think no deal is inconceivable by any manner of means. It's a perfectly plausible outcome, but the simple fact that both sides prefer a deal to no deal still makes me think that there is a pretty good chance that they will sign something in time for the end of the year deadline.
Okay, we will see. Anand Menon, thank you very much for that overview. We will see how this plays out. Thanks very much.
Absolute pleasure, Andy.
Anand Menon from the UK in a changing Europe. If you have thoughts on this or ideas for any future podcasts, please email me on andy.bell@itn.co.uk. And please go ahead and rate and review us as well. I'm tweeting on @AndyBell5News. Thank you for listening to this edition of How Did We Get Here? There will be another one along next week.